Cozy Powell's greatest performance did not take place on a stage. It took place on the M4 motorway. His art was not music. It was a controlled collision. On stage, he was the master of the near miss, a human machine that created the sound of collapsing buildings and shattering metal. And on that fateful night, he brought his art to its logical conclusion. No more control, no more the near miss, only the final, purest collision. That car crash was not an accident. It was his final drum solo. A brutal masterpiece performed only once with metal as the drumstick and asphalt as the drumhead. The final sound he ever made was silence. It is in that final void, the silence that must be understood before the thunder, that the true story begins to resonate. Colin Trevor Fluks was born on December 29, 1947, in Cirencester, Gloucestershire. This was a Britain shrouded in a monochrome veil of austerity. The war had been won, but the victory felt hollow. The nation was draped in gray, its spirit exhausted, its economy crippled, still healing the deep collective wounds of a conflict that had shattered an empire and a generation. Food, clothing, and petrol were still rationed. The cities bore the scars of the Blitz, and a pervasive sense of weariness hung in the air like the ever-present coal smoke. It was a world of making do, of stiff upper lips, of a generation taught to suppress emotion and soldier on. Yet beneath this placid, resilient surface, a quiet revolution was simmering. It was a revolution transmitted not through political pamphlets, but through the crackle of a radio receiver picking up a signal from a world away. Across the Atlantic, a new sound was being forged in the crucible of post-war American optimism, a raw, untamed electricity called rock and roll, the primal holler of Elvis Presley, the frantic piano of Jerry Lee Lewis, the driving beat of Little Richard. It was a sound that was everything post-war Britain was not: loud, vibrant, rebellious, and unapologetically alive. For the first generation of British teenagers who had no memory of the war, this music wasn't just a fleeting distraction. It was a lifeline. It was a vibrant, technicolor promise of another universe, a universe free from the gray conformity of their parents' world. Into this world of quiet desperation and burgeoning rebellion, Colin Fluks arrived under circumstances that would forever set him apart. He was adopted by a loving couple, his father a man who worked for the Great Western Railway when he was only a few weeks old. He would never know his birth parents. In the context of the 1950s, a time of rigid social structures and unspoken stigmas, being adopted was not a neutral fact. It was a defining characteristic, often whispered about in hushed tones. While raised in a stable, conventional, and caring middle-class home, the fundamental question of his origins created an invisible barrier. Friends and acquaintances from his youth would later recall a boy who was outwardly typical, polite, reserved, and determined, but who carried an air of detachment. This lack of a biological anchor meant he began life with a question mark at the very center of his being. He was a man perpetually out of sync, a traveler without a true point of origin, searching for a rhythm to lock into in a world that always felt slightly offbeat. He struggled to forge deep connections with people, but he would soon find his true connection, not in human interaction, but in the universal primal language of rhythm. His obsession began, as it often does, with a spark of inspiration. At the age of 12, he was conscripted into the school orchestra at Deer Park School. While his peers may have gravitated towards the more glamorous instruments, Colin found himself inexorably drawn to the percussive section. He was captivated not by the nascent British rock drummers of the time, but by the sophisticated swinging polyrhythms of American jazz masters. His idol, the man whose name he would one day adopt as his own, was Leo Cozy Cole, an American jazz drummer renowned for his impeccable technique and a hit instrumental, Topsy 2. Colin would spend hours locked away, a pair of wooden spoons in hand, tapping out the intricate patterns he heard on the radio, deconstructing the beats of his heroes with a forensic intensity. He was entirely self-taught, a product of pure, unadulterated obsession. This burgeoning passion, however, became a double-edged sword. His talent was undeniable, but in the hyper-conservative, conformist environment of a 1950s English grammar school, it also made him a target. He was the adopted boy, the one who was different from the start. Now he was also the boy obsessed with the loud and strange drums, an instrument considered unrefined and primitive by the establishment. This confluence of factors made him an easy mark for bullies. However, the early experience of being ostracized didn't break him. Instead, it taught him how to build a fortress. His drums became his walls, and his thunderous, powerful beat became his warning shot, a sonic declaration to the world that said, "Keep your distance. Do not fuck with me." He learned to answer the world's cruelty not with words, but with thunder. He learned early on that to survive as an outsider, you had to be tougher, more determined, and more uncompromising than anyone else. The world of academia could not compete with the allure of the beat. His schoolwork suffered as his nights were increasingly consumed by music. He joined his first proper band, the Chorals, a semi-professional group that played the local youth club and ballroom circuit. The thrill of performing, of locking into a groove and driving the energy of a room was a drug far more potent than any textbook. The late nights, the loading of heavy equipment, the sheer physical exertion of playing, it all took its toll on his studies. Faced with a choice between a future dictated by exam results and one dictated by a backbeat, Colin made a pivotal, life-altering decision. He quit school at 15. To his adoptive parents' credit, while likely concerned, they did not stand in his way. But the path to rock and roll glory was not paved with gold. To fund his dream, he took on a soul-crushingly mundane office job, shuffling papers for a local authority. For 9 months, he endured the monotonous tick of the office clock, a world of beige filing cabinets and silent, oppressive conformity. Every single penny he earned was meticulously saved, not for a car or for fashionable clothes, but for one singular purpose: to purchase his first professional Premier drum kit. It was a stark trade-off. He sacrificed a conventional, secure future for a shot, however slim, at his true calling. The day he finally bought that kit, he walked out of the office and never looked back. He was now a professional musician. The thunder was beginning to gather. In 1964, at the tender age of 17, Colin "Cozy" Powell made the leap from the sleepy Cotswolds to the wild, unforgiving crucible of the professional music world. He joined a band called the Sorcerers, and like countless other ambitious young British musicians of the era, plunged headfirst into the grueling German club scene. This was the same brutal, formative training ground that had famously forged the Beatles just a few years earlier, transforming them from a scruffy Liverpool beat group into a tight, world-conquering rock and roll machine. The clubs of Hamburg and Cologne were not for the faint of heart. They were dimly lit, beer-soaked caverns packed with rough, demanding crowds who expected non-stop entertainment. The routine was merciless. Bands were expected to play for hours on end, night after night, often for 7 or 8 sets a day. It was not a stage, it was a forge. You either developed superhuman stamina in an ironclad repertoire, or you burned out and were sent home in disgrace. Cozy didn't just survive this environment, he thrived in it. The sheer volume of playing time honed his skills to a razor's edge. He learned how to drive a band for hours, how to read a crowd, and how to project power and energy from the back of the stage. It was in these sweaty, chaotic German clubs that the foundations of his legendary power and stamina were laid. It was also here that the other side of his life began to take shape, a nomadic existence of constant travel, cheap hotels, and the ever-present temptations of life on the road. The adrenaline of the performance became intertwined with the chaos of the lifestyle. It was an environment where rules were bent and boundaries were blurred. And it was here that an early and largely buried incident offered a stark glimpse into the uncompromising and volatile nature that lay beneath his quiet exterior. According to accounts from his former bandmates, a heated disagreement erupted with a German club promoter over unpaid wages, a common issue for struggling British bands. The promoter was dismissive and arrogant. Cozy, whose sense of fairness was as rigid as his drum patterns, refused to back down. The argument escalated from shouting to shoving and then exploded into a full-blown bar brawl. The police were called, and Cozy was arrested and spent a night in a German jail cell. The incident was quickly hushed up by the band's management, a pragmatic move to avoid deportation and keep the precious gig. For Cozy, it was an early, brutal lesson in the often sordid realities of the music business, and a clear demonstration of a principle he would live by. You do not cross Cozy Powell. After several years of paying his dues in the German meat grinder, Cozy returned to the UK in the late 1960s. He was no longer a starry-eyed teenager, but a seasoned, formidable professional. He bounced between various bands, including a stint with the Ace Kefford Stand, the new project of the former bassist for The Move. He was building a reputation within the musician community as a heavy drummer, a reliable powerhouse with a rock-solid feel. But he was still waiting for the one big break, the moment that would lift him from the club circuit to the world stage. That moment arrived on a colossal scale in August 1970. Through his burgeoning reputation, he got a call to play with the acclaimed American swamp rocker Tony Joe White, famous for his hit Polk Salad Annie. The gig wasn't just any show. It was the colossal Isle of Wight Festival. This was the Woodstock of Britain, a legendary event that drew an almost unbelievable crowd of 600,000 people. As Cozy took his place behind his kit on that enormous stage, he looked out at a seemingly endless sea of humanity. The lineup was a who's who of rock royalty: The Who, The Doors, Joni Mitchell, Miles Davis. Just hours before his own set, Jimi Hendrix had delivered his final ever performance in the United Kingdom. This was the major leagues. The provincial kid from Cirencester, the boy who had taught himself to play on wooden spoons, was now breathing the same rarefied air as the gods of rock. As he launched into the first song, his powerful driving beat rolling across the massive crowd, Cozy Powell had, in no uncertain terms, arrived. A performance as powerful as the one Cozy delivered at the Isle of Wight does not go unnoticed. His thunderous yet nuanced playing caught the ear of one of Britain's most revered, innovative, and notoriously difficult guitar virtuosos, Jeff Beck. Beck, having recently dissolved the first incarnation of his band that had launched the careers of Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood, was assembling a new, more musically ambitious lineup. He needed a drummer who could do more than just keep time. He needed a musician with immense power, technical dexterity, and the creative fire to match his own volatile guitar explorations. In late 1970, Cozy Powell got the call that would change his life. Joining the Jeff Beck Group was the equivalent of being knighted in the world of British rock. It was an instant elevation to the A-list. The new lineup, featuring Bobby Tench on vocals, Clive Shaman on bass, and Max Middleton on keyboards, was a powerhouse of talent. Together, they recorded two seminal, if commercially overlooked, albums, Rough and Ready, 1971, and the self-titled Jeff Beck Group, 1972, often referred to as the Orange Album. The music they created was a potent, volatile fusion of hard rock, deep blues, soul, and funk. It was complex, dynamic, and demanded a drummer of extraordinary caliber. Cozy's drumming was the anchor in this musical hurricane. He provided a thunderous, intricate, and impeccably solid foundation upon which Beck could unleash his wild, unpredictable guitar genius. Tracks like Got the Feeling and Ice Cream Cakes showcased his ability to blend raw, visceral power with deep, funky grooves, a combination that would become his trademark. But the very chemistry that made the band so potent on record also made it incredibly combustible off stage. Both Jeff Beck and Cozy Powell were uncompromising perfectionists, alpha males with fiercely independent artistic visions. They were musical equals, and they knew it. The creative tension was immense, as Cozy himself would famously say in a later interview, reflecting on his many collaborations with strong personalities. Fire needs fire. The inevitable clashes of ego and musical direction were constant. Studio sessions were often tense, fraught with arguments that, while fueling the music's aggressive edge, also doomed the band's longevity. In July 1972, after just 2 albums, the explosive alliance came to its predictable end. Jeff Beck dissolved the group. It was during this intense, creatively fertile period that one of rock and roll's most tantalizing and persistent rumors was born. The Jeff Beck Group was recording at Electric Lady Studios in New York at the same time that another musical genius, Stevie Wonder, was working on his groundbreaking album, Talking Book. Beck was invited to play on one of Wonder's tracks, which would become the legendary funk masterpiece, Superstition. According to Cozy, he and the rest of the Beck band were also present at the session, and he laid down the iconic, instantly recognizable drum track. For years, Cozy maintained that he, uncredited and unpaid, was the drummer on Superstition. It's a claim that has become a cornerstone of the Cozy Powell mythology, a secret credit on a Motown masterpiece. Is it true? The official album credits list Stevie Wonder himself as the drummer, and his prodigious multi-instrumental talent certainly makes that plausible. However, the beat has a power and a driving rock feel that is undeniably Powell-esque. The story has never been officially verified by the Wonder camp, and it remains a fascinating what if, a tantalizing secret whispered among rock aficionados, a testament to a moment when the worlds of British hard rock and American funk collided in a legendary studio session. After the implosion of the Jeff Beck Group, Cozy found himself in high demand. He became a first-call session musician for the legendary producer Mickey Most and his RAK Records label. For the next year, Cozy's drumming powered hits for artists like Suzi Quatro, Hot Chocolate, and Donovan. It was steady, lucrative work, but it was creatively unfulfilling. He was a craftsman for hire, his unique voice subsumed by the demands of pop production. He was a lion in a cage, and he was restless. Then, in 1973, he did the unthinkable. In an era completely dominated by flamboyant frontmen and virtuosic guitar heroes, Cozy Powell, the drummer, decided to release a solo single. And not just a single, but a drum instrumental. The very idea was audacious, almost laughable to industry insiders. Who would buy a pop song with no singer and no guitar solo, just a primal beat? The track was called Dance with the Devil, built around a thundering tom-tom heavy rhythm inspired by the classical piece Venus, the Bringer of Peace, from Holst's The Planets. It was a primal, menacing, and ridiculously catchy piece of music. It was pure, distilled Cozy Powell. Against all odds and expectations, the public loved it. Dance with the Devil became a monster hit, shooting to number 3 in the UK charts and turning Cozy into a household name. Suddenly, The man who had always been at the back of the stage was a bona fide pop star, his face appearing on the popular TV show Top of the Pops. It was a moment of supreme validation. He had proven that a drummer could be more than just a timekeeper. He could be a star, a composer, an artist with his own distinct and powerful voice. The quiet, adopted boy from Cirencester was now officially a rock and roll celebrity. The thunder he had been forging for over a decade had finally broken loose. Having established himself as a formidable force in the British rock scene through his groundbreaking work with Jeff Beck and the unexpected success of his solo hit, Cozy Powell stood at a pivotal moment. The journeyman years had forged his skills and reputation, but his next move would elevate him from a respected musician to a global rock icon. The call from Ritchie Blackmore to join Rainbow was not just another gig, it was an entry into the pantheon of hard rock royalty. This new chapter, the heart of the rock machine, would see him reach the zenith of his powers, becoming the thunderous engine for one of the era's most legendary bands, while simultaneously indulging a dangerous passion that mirrored the intensity of his music. The year is 1974. Cozy Powell is improbably a pop star. His instrumental hit had made him a familiar face to millions who had never heard of the Jeff Beck Group. He was an anomaly, a serious musician who had accidentally stumbled into the disposable world of teen pop. The success brought him financial security and a level of fame he had never actively sought, but it also placed him at a professional crossroads. He was a rock drummer, a craftsman of power and complexity, yet his biggest commercial success was a 3-minute novelty hit. To capitalize on the momentum, he formed a new band, Cozy Powell's Hammer. The lineup was formidable, featuring guitarist Bernie Marsden, who would later find fame with Whitesnake, and the veteran bluesman Don Airey on keyboards. They recorded an album's worth of material and toured extensively, but the project never quite ignited. It was a solid blues rock outfit, but it lacked the dangerous, innovative spark of his work with Beck. The Hammer was a vehicle, but it wasn't his ultimate destination. Cozy was, once again, a gun for hire, a master without a war to fight. This newfound fame and financial freedom, however, allowed him to pour his energy and resources into the other great all-consuming passion of his life, speed. For Cozy Powell, music was his craft, his profession, the arena in which he had achieved mastery. But motor racing was his obsession, his addiction, the place he went to feel truly, terrifyingly alive. The adrenaline he experienced behind a drum kit was a controlled, channeled surge of power. The adrenaline behind the wheel of a race car was something else entirely, a flirtation with chaos, a dance with oblivion on the knife's edge of control. He once famously summarized his philosophy in a single telling phrase, "I drive like I drum, madly." This was no exaggeration. It was his personal and professional creed. He wasn't a dilettante playing at being a racer. He was a serious, dedicated, and professionally licensed competitor. He threw himself into the world of saloon car racing with the same obsessive focus he had once applied to learning Cozy Cole's drum patterns. His weapon of choice was a bright yellow Mazda RX-3, its panels plastered with the logo of his sponsor, the electronics giant Hitachi. He became a familiar sight on the racetracks of Britain, a rock star who could genuinely hold his own against seasoned professionals. The racing paddock was his sanctuary, a place where he wasn't Cozy Powell, the famous drummer, but Colin Flooks, the driver. It was a world of grease, engine oil, and the smell of burning rubber, a world away from the perfumed artifice of the music industry. Here, his uncompromising nature and short fuse were assets, not liabilities. The singular focus required to pilot a car at its absolute limit suited his personality perfectly. But this dual life was a dangerous balancing act. The two worlds, that of the musician and the racer, were fundamentally at odds. A musician's greatest assets are his hands and feet, the delicate instruments of his craft. A racer's profession involves the constant, imminent risk of catastrophic physical injury. In the mid-1970s, during a race, this risk became a terrifying reality. Hurtling down a straight, another driver made a critical error, sending Cozy's Mazda into a violent multi-impact crash. The car was mangled, a wreck of twisted metal and shattered fiberglass. Cozy was lucky to escape with his life, sustaining injuries that, while not career-ending, were significant enough to put him out of commission for weeks. He kept the incident quiet, downplaying its severity to the press and, more importantly, to his record label. The last thing he needed was a contract clause forbidding him from pursuing his passion. The crash was a chilling foreshadowing, a stark warning of the lethal consequences of his addiction to speed. It was a warning he would hear, but ultimately failed to heed. He recovered, repaired his car, and got right back on the track. The thirst for adrenaline was simply too strong to deny. Meanwhile, in the world of rock and roll, a titan was stirring. Ritchie Blackmore, the enigmatic, supremely gifted, and notoriously tyrannical guitarist of Deep Purple, had grown weary of his own creation. At the height of their global fame, Blackmore felt the band was stagnating, drifting into a funk-influenced direction he despised. In 1975, in a move that shocked the music world, he quit. Blackmore was not just any guitarist. He was a godlike figure, a man in black whose blend of classical virtuosity and blues rock ferocity had inspired a generation. His departure from one of the world's biggest bands created a power vacuum and a wave of anticipation. What would he do next? The answer came in the form of a new band, forged from the ashes of an American group called Elf, which had previously opened for Deep Purple. Blackmore had been captivated by their singer, a pocket-sized powerhouse with a soaring operatic voice named Ronnie James Dio. Blackmore took Dio, recorded a debut album titled Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, and then, in a typically ruthless move, fired the entire backing band. He had his singer. Now he needed a band of giants to bring his new epic musical vision to life. He needed a bassist with flair, a keyboardist with classical chops, and most importantly, he needed a drummer of monumental power and stature. He needed someone who could not only handle the complexity of his compositions, but who also had the sheer force of personality to stand on a stage with him and not be intimidated. There was only one man for the job. In late 1975, the phone rang. It was Ritchie Blackmore's management. Cozy Powell's days as a journeyman were over. He was about to become the engine of one of the most legendary hard rock bands of all time. Joining Rainbow was not like joining any other band. It was a summons, an induction into a new order of rock royalty built around the singular, mercurial vision of Ritchie Blackmore. The partnership that formed between Blackmore and Powell would become the central, defining axis of the band for the next 5 years. They were the only two constants in a revolving door of musicians, a testament to their volatile but undeniable chemistry. They were in many ways mirror images of each other, both supremely confident, technically brilliant, and utterly uncompromising perfectionists. They were fire and fire. With the recruitment of Scottish bassist Jimmy Bain and American keyboardist Tony Carey, the classic Rainbow lineup was forged. In February 1976, they entered Musicland Studios in Munich to record what would become their masterpiece, the album Rising. From the outset, it was clear this was not merely a collection of rock songs. It was a grand, ambitious statement. Blackmore was shedding the blues-based rock of Deep Purple and venturing into uncharted territory, a fusion of hard rock muscle and European classical grandeur. Ronnie James Dio's lyrics abandoned rock's typical themes of cars and women in favor of epic sword and sorcery tales of wizards, dragons, and celestial struggles. It was a bold, almost pretentious vision, and it required a musical foundation of seismic proportions to avoid collapsing into self-parody. That foundation was Cozy Powell. His drumming on Rising is a masterclass in rock percussion. It is a perfect synthesis of brute force, technical precision, and musical intelligence. On tracks like Tarot Woman and Starstruck, he drives the band with a relentless, swaggering groove. But it is on the album's epic centerpiece, the 8.5-minute opus Stargazer, that his legend was truly cemented. The song opens with one of the most iconic drum intros in rock history, a short, powerful, rolling fill that is instantly recognizable and utterly monumental. It is the sound of a giant awakening. Throughout the song's complex arrangement, which features the Munich Philharmonic Orchestra, Cozy's drumming is the architectural framework that supports the entire colossal structure. He is not just keeping time, he is orchestrating the drama, building tension and releasing it with explosive, crashing waves of power. He understood intuitively that to make Blackmore's neoclassical guitar wizardry and Dio's operatic vocals believable, the rhythm had to be delivered with the weight and authority of a divine proclamation. Rising was a triumph, an album that redefined the boundaries of hard rock and laid the groundwork for what would become heavy metal. The band embarked on a world tour, and their live shows quickly became the stuff of legend. On stage, the chemistry between the members was electric. Blackmore, a menacing figure in black, would coax otherworldly sounds from his Fender Stratocaster, often seeming to be in a personal battle with his instrument. Dio, a commanding presence despite his small stature, would hold audiences captive with his incredible vocal power, and behind them all, perched atop a monolithic drum riser, was Cozy, a whirlwind of motion and power, driving the sonic assault with a joyous ferocity. It was during these tours that Cozy developed his legendary drum solo, a piece of pure rock and roll theater that became a highlight of every Rainbow concert. It wasn't just a display of technical skill, it was a full-blown spectacle. He would perform his solo as an accompaniment to a recording of Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, his powerful drumming perfectly synchronized with the piece's thundering cannons and soaring orchestral themes. The performance was a feast for the senses, complete with a dazzling light show, pyrotechnic explosions, and even flaming gongs that he would strike at the solo's climax. It was audacious, over-the-top, and utterly magnificent. It elevated the drummer from accompanist to co-star, a showman whose theatrical flair was a worthy match for Blackmore's guitar-smashing antics. He was, without question, at the absolute zenith of his career, a globally recognized and idolized drumming icon. The fortress that was Rainbow, however, was built on the unstable ground of Ritchie Blackmore's creative whims. The same perfectionism that had driven the band to create an album as brilliant as Rising also made Blackmore an impossible bandleader to work for. He demanded absolute commitment to his vision, and his notorious moods and unpredictable behavior created a constant atmosphere of tension. Following the triumphant Rising tour, Blackmore, dissatisfied for reasons only he truly understood, summarily fired bassist Jimmy Bain and keyboardist Tony Carey. Cozy and Dio were stunned. The magical chemistry of the classic lineup had been shattered. It was the first clear sign that for Blackmore, Rainbow was not a band of brothers, but a vehicle for his own talent, and all its other members were ultimately expendable. The band regrouped with new members for the 1978 album Long Live Rock and Roll. While a powerful record in its own right, featuring classic anthems like the title track and the epic Gates of Babylon, the creative magic of Rising was elusive. The cracks were beginning to show. The fatal blow to the classic Rainbow era came shortly after the album's release. Ronnie James Dio, frustrated with Blackmore's increasing desire to write more commercially accessible, radio-friendly songs, left the band to eventually replace Ozzy Osbourne in Black Sabbath. Dio's departure was a monumental loss. He was more than just a singer, he was the lyrical and thematic soul of the band. For Cozy, the departure of his friend and ally was a deep blow. He and Dio had been the twin pillars standing alongside Blackmore. Now he stood alone. Blackmore, however, was determined to achieve the elusive prize of mainstream success in the American market. He recruited a new singer, the handsome, leather-lunged Graham Bonnet, and brought in his former Deep Purple bandmate, Roger Glover, as a producer and bassist. The mission was clear: write hit singles. The result was the 1979 album Down to Earth. Musically, it was a sharp commercial pivot. The epic fantasy-themed compositions were gone, replaced by shorter, catchier, and more conventional rock anthems. The album was a huge commercial success, spawning 2 top 10 UK hits, Since You've Been Gone and All Night Long. Rainbow was now bigger than ever, playing to massive arenas and selling millions of records. But for Cozy Powell, this success felt hollow. It was a betrayal of the band's original epic sound. He had signed on to play thunderous, complex, quasi-classical hard rock, not 3-minute pop rock songs. In interviews from the period, his disillusionment is palpable. While always professional, he made no secret of his preference for the band's earlier, heavier material. He saw the new direction as a compromise, a watering down of the band's artistic integrity for the sake of commercial gain. The fire that had once fueled his partnership with Blackmore was now turning into the slow burn of resentment. He was contractually obligated to tour for the new album, but in his heart, he had already checked out. He was a craftsman being asked to build prefab furniture when he was capable of constructing cathedrals. The final triumphant act of Cozy Powell's tenure in Rainbow came on August 16, 1980. The band was chosen to headline the first ever Monsters of Rock Festival at Castle Donington, England. It was a landmark event, the birth of the modern open-air heavy metal festival in Britain. In front of a massive rain-soaked crowd, Rainbow delivered a blistering, career-spanning performance. It was a triumphant homecoming and a coronation for the new, commercially successful lineup. But for Cozy, it was a farewell. Looking out at the sea of fans, he knew this was the end of the road. He had reached the summit with this version of the band, but it was a summit he had no desire to remain on. Shortly after the Donington show, after 5 years, 4 studio albums, and countless legendary performances, Cozy Powell walked away from Rainbow. He wasn't fired. He quit. He voluntarily left one of the biggest rock bands in the world at the peak of its commercial power because it no longer aligned with his unbending principles. He chose integrity over compromise, power over pop. It was a decision that solidified his reputation not just as a great drummer, but as a man of immense character. The Rainbow had faded for him. He was a journeyman once more, a master craftsman in search of a new machine to power. By walking away from Rainbow at the peak of their commercial success, Cozy Powell made a profound statement about his artistic integrity. He chose power over pop, substance over sales, cementing his reputation as a man of unbending principle. This decision closed the door on the most stable and iconic period of his career, but opened another, casting him as rock's most prestigious journeyman. The final chapter of his life, the final thunderclap, would see him lend his immense talent to a who's who of rock legends, a nomadic existence that mirrored his restless spirit. This period would be a testament to his enduring craftsmanship, but it would also lead to the convergence of his passions and demons, culminating in a tragic final crescendo. The year is 1980. Cozy Powell has walked away from the biggest gig of his life. In the wake of his departure from Rainbow, he is a free agent, but a free agent of immense stature. He is no longer just a great drummer. He is a brand, a seal of quality, a guarantee of world-class power and professionalism. The music landscape was changing rapidly around him. The new wave of British heavy metal, a movement he had profoundly influenced, was exploding across the UK, with bands like Iron Maiden and Saxon taking the blueprint he had helped create and pushing it to faster, more aggressive extremes. In America, the glossy, image-driven world of MTV was dawning, a world that prized photogenic frontmen over musical substance. Into this new decade stepped Cozy, the ultimate journeyman. His career for the next 18 years would be a nomadic odyssey, a whirlwind tour through a staggering number of legendary bands and supergroups. He became rock's most prestigious mercenary, a hired gun whose thunderous beats could revitalize a flagging band or launch a new one into the stratosphere. But this constant movement also spoke to a deeper truth about the man. Why could he never find a permanent home? Perhaps the answer lay in his very nature. He was too powerful a personality, too uncompromising in his musical vision, to be a subordinate for long. The same fire needs fire mentality that made him the perfect foil for Ritchie Blackmore also made it impossible for him to remain in any one place. He was, in a sense, a victim of his own strength. And perhaps, on a deeper level, the adopted boy who never knew his roots was destined to be a rolling stone, forever searching for a sense of belonging, a musical family that he could only ever find for a fleeting album and a tour cycle at a time. His first port of call after Rainbow was a brief reunion with singer Graham Bonnet in a new band, Graham Bonnet and the Force. It was a testament to Cozy's loyalty, but the project was short-lived. A far more significant alliance was just around the corner. He was recruited by another guitar genius with a reputation for being notoriously difficult, the German wunderkind Michael Schenker. Schenker, having left the band UFO, was forming the Michael Schenker Group, MSG, and he needed a drummer with the power and prestige to match his own. The partnership was, predictably, another case of two immense talents colliding. The results were explosive. Cozy's drumming on the first two MSG albums, particularly the iconic live record One Night at Budokan, is stunningly powerful. He drove the band with a ferocious energy that pushed Schenker to new heights of brilliance. But, just as predictably, the two alpha personalities clashed, and after 2 years, Cozy was on the move once again. In 1982, he received a call from another giant of British rock. David Coverdale was retooling his band, Whitesnake, with a single-minded ambition to conquer the lucrative American market. Their sound needed to be bigger, punchier, and more radio-friendly. Cozy Powell was the man to provide the necessary firepower. He was brought in to re-record the drum tracks for the U.S. version of their album Slide It In. His impact was immediate and profound. He replaced the existing blues shuffle grooves with a powerful, straight-ahead, rock-solid backbeat that transformed the album into a hard rock juggernaut fit for American arenas. He joined the band for the subsequent world tour, his legendary status adding significant credibility to Coverdale's project. Yet again, however, the tenure was short. Cozy was a hired gun, brought in to do a specific job. Once that job was done, and faced with the prospect of being a sideman in what was clearly Coverdale's band, his restless spirit took over, and he departed after just one album cycle. His next move was perhaps the most unexpected and artistically ambitious of his career. In 1985, he joined forces with two-thirds of the legendary progressive rock trio, Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. With original drummer Carl Palmer committed to the supergroup Asia, Keith Emerson and Greg Lake needed a drummer of extraordinary technical ability to fill his shoes. The result was Emerson, Lake, and Powell. This was a world away from the straightforward hard rock he was known for. He was now navigating the complex time signatures, intricate arrangements, and classically influenced compositions of Keith Emerson. It was a monumental challenge, and one he met with astonishing skill. Their self-titled 1986 album is a testament to his incredible versatility, proving that beneath the brute force lay a musician of immense subtlety and technical finesse. The project was critically acclaimed, but ultimately short-lived, as the original ELP lineup would eventually reconvene. After the prog rock explorations of ELP, Cozy found what was arguably his most fitting and longest-lasting musical home of the post-Rainbow era. In 1988, he joined Black Sabbath. The Sabbath of the late 80s was a band in flux. Guitarist Tony Iommi, the sole remaining original member, was the keeper of the flame, struggling to maintain the band's legacy through a series of lineup changes. The recruitment of Cozy Powell was a masterstroke. He brought not only his thunderous drumming, but also a sense of stability and authority that the band desperately needed. His impact was immediate. The 1989 album Headless Cross, featuring the powerful vocals of Tony Martin, was hailed by critics and fans as a stunning return to form. It was the best Black Sabbath album in years, and much of the credit was given to Cozy. His drumming was the engine that drove Iommi's dark, monumental riffs, restoring the sense of epic, doom-laden power that had defined the band's classic era. He became an integral part of the band, co-writing songs and helping to shape their creative direction. He followed it up with another strong album, Tear, in 1990. For the first time in a decade, it seemed as if Cozy had finally found a permanent home, a band of brothers where his immense talent was both needed and respected. He had forged a strong, mutually respectful partnership with Tony Iommi, a fellow craftsman who valued substance over flash. But fate, it seemed, would not allow him to stay settled for long. In 1991, in a bizarre and tragic accident completely unrelated to either music or motor racing, he was crushed by a horse he was riding on his property. The accident was severe, shattering his hip and pelvis. The injuries were so grievous that he was unable to play the drums for the better part of a year, forcing him to leave Black Sabbath. It was a cruel twist of irony that a man who lived his life at 200 miles per hour, both literally and figuratively, would be sidelined by such a pastoral incident. He would eventually recover and, ever the professional, dive straight back into work. The final years of his life were a blur of high-profile sessions and projects. He played on the solo album of Queen's Brian May, providing the powerful backbeat for his post-Freddie Mercury musical endeavors. He toured with the reunited Peter Green's Splinter Group, returning to the blues rock roots of his youth. He even recorded with the notoriously flashy Swedish guitar virtuoso Yngwie Malmsteen. And in 1994, he briefly rejoined Black Sabbath for the Forbidden Album and tour. His discography had swelled to an astonishing number, appearing on at least 66 albums, a monumental body of work that traced the very history of hard rock and heavy metal for 3 decades. He was the ultimate survivor, the constant presence, the craftsman who simply never stopped working. But who was the man behind this monumental catalog of thunder? Away from the stage lights and the roar of the crowd, Colin Flux was a deeply private and contradictory figure. The explosive, flamboyant showman who commanded stages across the globe was, at heart, a quiet countryman. He loved the tranquility of his home near Lambourne, finding solace in the rolling hills of the English countryside. He was an avid animal lover, a man who preferred the company of his dogs and horses to the endless parties and sycophants of the music industry. Yet the storm was always there, just beneath the surface. His identity as an adopted child, the rootless beginning to his life's journey, seemed to shadow his entire existence, fueling a restless, nomadic life. His career was a perpetual search for a place to belong, a series of temporary families that he would inevitably leave or that would dissolve around him. His love for speed was more than just a hobby. It was a physical manifestation of his personality, a compulsion he could not or would not control. Friends and fellow musicians remember him as an intensely loyal and generous man, but one with a notoriously short fuse. He demanded the same level of commitment, professionalism, and integrity from others that he demanded of himself. This fire needs fire philosophy explains his incredible synergy with other titans like Blackmore and Schenker, but it also guaranteed a short shelf life for those volatile alliances. He thrived in the storm, but no ship could contain such a storm for long. He couldn't bend, and he wouldn't break. In the final years of his life, his notoriously guarded personal life began to unravel. He became involved in a turbulent, all-consuming relationship with a married woman. It was a tangled, passionate, and chaotic affair that brought him immense emotional distress. The chaos of his personal life, a whirlwind of desperate phone calls and emotional turmoil, was beginning to eclipse the steadfast precision of his craft. The master of timing was losing control of his own life. This tangled relationship would become the unwitting catalyst for his final fatal ride. The final tragic controversy of Cozy Powell's life was his death itself. It was not a glamorous rock and roll exit, nor was it a simple, unavoidable accident. The subsequent police investigation revealed a perfect storm of reckless decisions, a catastrophic convergence of his lifelong impulsiveness and his immediate emotional turmoil. The facts laid bare in the coroner's report were stark and damning. He was driving his Saab 9000 at a confirmed speed of 104 miles per hour, 167 kilometers per hour. He was doing this in treacherous, storm-like weather conditions on a public motorway at night. He was over the legal alcohol limit, his judgment clouded by drink. He was not wearing a seatbelt, a final act of defiance against the most basic of safety measures. And, at the moment of the crash, he was using his mobile phone. The call he was making, the one that had been a recurring frantic exchange throughout his journey, was to his distressed lover. He was rushing to her side, his mind consumed by her emotional state, his rational decision-making abilities crippled by alcohol, speed, and passion. To complete this perfect storm, investigators found that a slow puncture in a rear tire may have been the final fatal factor, causing the car to destabilize at such a high speed. He didn't die in a blaze of rock and roll glory on a stage. He died alone in the dark, on a wet stretch of motorway in a moment of profound personal chaos. His death was a direct consequence of the very same reckless abandon and obsessive intensity that had defined his entire life. The man who lived his life by the creed, "Drive like I drum madly," had finally met an end that was both. So what is the legacy of Cozy Powell? It is not to be found in the tragic, messy details of his death, but in the thunderous, immortal body of work he left behind. His legacy is etched into the very DNA of modern rock and metal drumming. His revolutionary combination of raw, untamed power, meticulous technical precision, and pure, unadulterated showmanship influenced countless thousands of drummers who followed. From the arenas of the 1970s to the bedrooms of aspiring musicians today, his impact is immeasurable. He proved emphatically that a drummer could be more than just a timekeeper in the shadows. A drummer could be a star, a composer, a driving force with his own distinct and powerful voice. His life was a profound study in contradictions. He was the quiet, private man who created a sound of unimaginable public volume. He was the adopted boy from a sleepy country town who became a god in the global pantheon of rock. He was the absolute master of perfect timing, whose own time on earth ran out in a single chaotic, ill-judged moment. He was the architect of thunder, a man who gifted the world with a perfect storm of sound, but who was ultimately consumed by the very same storm that raged inside his own heart. The man is gone. The chaos is silenced. The music, however, remains, and every time you hear that cannon-like snare drum, that earthquake of a double bass kick, that perfectly placed explosive cymbal crash on a classic recording, you are hearing the echo of Cozy Powell, an echo of thunder that will never fade.